What happens when a timeless God creates a temporal universe? Does he stay outside of time, untouched by change? Or does he step into time? And if so, does he gain new experiences? Today we're going to explore two theological models. The view of classical theism, where God remains eternally timeless, versus William Lane Craig's view, where God is initially timeless, sans creation as he likes to put it, or without creation, and then God enters time upon creating. Both views, I think, lead to serious internal contradictions. Part 1. The timeless God of classical theism. In classical theism, think Augustine or Aquinas, God is and remains timeless. God doesn't exist in time. He doesn't move through time or apprehend things as past, present, or future. Instead, God exists in a state sometimes called the eternal now. All of reality, from the Big Bang to every moment in an eternal afterlife, is present to God at once. Creation and God's relation to it doesn't begin for God. It's not something that happens from his point of view. Rather, it is eternally present to the divine mind in one single freeze frame. Here's an analogy courtesy of one of my excellent viewers, Yin Yang Mountain. Any errors are mine, of course. The analogy goes as follows. To get a sense of what God's timeless perspective might be like, imagine watching 3 semi-translucent screens stacked in front of you. Each one shows you at a different moment, 1 second ago, right now, and 1 second from now. Because the screens are semi-translucent and perfectly aligned, you can see all 3 versions of yourself simultaneously. Past, present, and future, all visible at once. Now, expand that idea. Imagine not just 3 screens, but an infinite number of screens, each showing the entirety of existence with every moment from start to finish at the same time. That's roughly how classical theism envisions God's eternal experience. Not watching things unfold moment by moment, but apprehending all of existence in a single, changeless act of awareness. So what's the problem with that? Well, if God is omniscient and eternally aware of absolutely everything, then the universe and the afterlife have always existed from God's point of view. That is, there was never a moment for him when they didn't exist. That's kind of hard to square with creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing, or with the idea that God had a choice. After all, how could he ever have not created the universe if creation is eternally present to him? Part 2. Craig's temporal God. To try and avoid some of these issues, Christian philosopher William Lane Craig takes a different path. Craig argues that God is timeless without creation, but that in creating the universe, God brings time into being and simultaneously enters it himself.
And so the way I would put it is this, is that God is timeless without creation, and he is temporal since the moment of creation. So the decision to create on God's part is a decision to enter into time, to take on a temporal mode of existence in order to relate to his creatures.
So, before or sans creation, to avoid temporal language, God is timeless, no change, no succession, no stream of awareness. At the moment of creation, God causes time to begin and enters time himself. And God then becomes a being who experiences succession and tensed facts. Facts about what is happening, has happened, or will happen from within the present moment God now inhabits. And thus he undergoes what Craig calls both an extrinsic and an intrinsic change. The extrinsic change is that Craig believes God's relational status changes. He comes to stand in a new relation to a temporal, ever-changing creation. And the intrinsic change is that God's knowledge changes as tensed facts change, which is an intrinsic change in God's mental life, as his knowledge updates and he continuously forms new present tense beliefs to reflect what is happening in every new now. A genuine change in God's conscious experience. Craig writes, quote, "For since what is happening in the world is in constant flux, so also must God's knowledge of what is happening be in constant flux." Close quote. From Time and Eternity, page 97. That's a major departure from the classical doctrine of immutability, in which God is held to be unchanging in all respects. Also note that Craig's view presupposes the existence of a universal now. But this conflicts with modern physics, particularly Einstein's theory of relativity, which rejects any single objective present shared by all observers, including a temporal God. What one observer calls now will be past or future for another, depending on their relative motion and location in space-time. If Einsteinian relativity is correct, and there is also a God that is truly temporal as per Craig's view, then God's awareness of the now would also depend on his own position and velocity in space-time, which appears to be incoherent if God is spaceless and immaterial. So, to be able to have a universal now for this spaceless, immaterial being, Craig controversially defends a minority model known as neo-Lorentzian relativity, which allows for an absolute now by postulating a hidden, undetectable, preferred frame of reference, which goes directly against Einstein's theory, which has no preferred frame. That way, Craig can have a temporal God that experiences an absolute now. But why the need for a temporal God in the first place, right? Well, Craig argues that the God of classical theism would only know tenseless facts, like Mary Wollstonecraft dies on 10th of September 1797. And to Craig, a God who only knows tenseless facts is cognitively inferior to a God who also knows what is happening in a tensed way relative to now. For example, Mary Wollstonecraft is dying right now, or now it has been 228 years since the death of Mary Wollstonecraft. God's omniscience, Craig claims, requires knowing tensed facts as well, and so God's mental life must be temporally dynamic. This knowledge can't exist in timeless eternity because the present constantly shifts. In fact, Craig formulates an argument for God's temporality this way. Quote, 1. A temporal world exists. 2. God is omniscient. 3. If the temporal world exists, then if God is omniscient, God knows tensed facts. 4. If God is timeless, he does not know tensed facts. 5. Therefore, God is not timeless. Close quote. From Time and Eternity, page 100. Craig concludes that when God enters time, he begins experiencing time and the succession of moments. In this way, the temporal God has a constantly shifting stream of awareness, a form of consciousness that only arises upon entering time. A new experience, it seems, similar to Mary the colour scientist who never saw colour, then experiencing red for the first time. But if God is truly omniscient before or sans creation, then he must already know with perfect detail what every moment of temporal experience is like. From eternity, he would already grasp what it feels like when Martin Luther King Jr. dies, or feeling joy at the camps being liberated in World War II. So what does entering time actually add to the knowledge? Craig tries to resolve this by saying that God gains new indexical knowledge in his temporal state. While still timeless, God knows all events propositionally, but when temporal, God gains new indexical tensed experiences. That is the nowness and here-ness of a moment. So, for example, God eternally knows that Martin Luther King Jr. dies on a particular day, but once in time, God experiences that event as happening now, and then having happened yesterday, etc., etc. But to me, that still seems incoherent given omniscience. Again, if God is truly omniscient sans creation, without creation, then he also already must know in full what every moment and experience feels like to him. From eternity, he must be aware of every emotional, personal, lived experience. If that's the case, then God's experience of a moment in time adds nothing. It merely replays what he already knows perfectly, down to every detail. It's not a new experience. If something is added, then God lacked something without creation and thus wasn't perfect. If nothing is added, then the tensed experience is just divine omniscience looping back to what was always in his awareness. In this latter case, where nothing is added, if God's timeless awareness already includes his full future temporal awareness, then the temporal self is already eternally present and contained within the timeless self. The new temporal experiences were thus never new. They were always experienced, as it would seem to befit a perfect being. However, as I noted earlier, Craig appears to have the unorthodox view that the timeless God's sans creation was cognitively imperfect. Quote, "A being whose knowledge is composed exclusively of tenseless facts is less excellent cognitively than a being who also knows what has occurred, what is occurring, and what will occur in the world. This latter person knows infinitely more than the former and is involved in no cognitive defect in so knowing." Close quote. From Time and Eternity, page 108. But to me that undermines divine perfection, because a perfect being cannot be improved. A being who goes from a lesser state of knowledge to a superior one is not maximally excellent to begin with. Craig could reply that, as per the Molinist point of view that he holds, God timelessly knows that he will create this world, and so there was never a time when his temporal knowledge did not supplement his timeless knowledge. But then creation is necessitated to perfect him, not a contingent choice. Creation wouldn't be a free act, it would be necessary for God to be maximally excellent. If becoming temporal is what completes God's cognitive perfection, then can creation really be contingent? That is optional. But Craig insists it's a free choice. Here's how he puts it.
If God chooses to remain changeless and alone and never create, then he will exist timelessly. But if he chooses to create a world, then he will exist temporally.
So, in classical theism, God doesn't enter time, but this makes creation eternal and inevitable, not a free choice. The entire universe and afterlife become co-eternal with God. In this classical model, creation, the universe and afterlife begins from our point of view, but not from God's. It never didn't exist for him. In Craig's model, God freely creates and does enter time, but that raises its own questions. How can a timeless being transition from no time to time without invoking time? Change is an inherently temporal notion. Timeless until time is incoherent. And how can you maintain divine immutability when Craig has to redefine it to include not just extrinsic change in God, but even intrinsic change in God upon becoming temporal? Plus, how can a timeless, omniscient God gain new experiences once he becomes temporal? If God, being omniscient, truly omniscient, knew everything from eternity, or knows everything from eternity, including what it's like to enter and be in time, then entering time doesn't add anything new. God's timeless knowledge would already include his own future tensed experiences. You can't gain an experience you've eternally possessed. And if Craig wants to argue that God upon entering time became more cognitively excellent than he was before or without time, then he seems to be saying a perfect being can improve. And then creation is necessary to cognitively perfect God. It's not a contingent choice. These aren't just small cracks in the two models. Both models present a God concept that ends up being internally incoherent as far as I'm concerned. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, hit like, subscribe, and let me know which contradiction you prefer. See you next time. Bye.